Down in the valley to pray.
Hey everybody, welcome back on this Wednesday leading into Easter weekend. We're just taking a few minutes each day to align our hearts and minds around what God might want to do in us as we prepare for Easter. There's a long-running show on TV that you probably saw, or at least certainly heard about. It was called Dirty Jobs. And it was a reality show where the host and a camera crew would shadow someone who had, an extraordinarily messy or unique, sometimes disgusting, but always difficult job. And a lot of the jobs were occupations where most people, would not be willing to step into, right? One of the jobs I remember hearing about on that show was a fish taxidermist. So you can guess what that is. And then there was a worm rancher, which feels a little different than like a horse or cattle rancher, like they raised worms. But because people don't want those jobs, typically the pay can be a little bit more competitive. There are other jobs like this that you see, like a gastroenterologist who, has a starting salary of like $250,000, even though the job stinks, like literally stinks. But the pay is pretty good. There are some jobs, though, featured on Dirty Jobs that were odd and didn't seem to pay very well. And so I would always kind of wonder, why would anybody do that job if that's all you get from it? I had some jobs like this. I was a landscaper when I was coming out of high school before starting college. For like 3 or 4 months, I just did landscaping. It was a miserably difficult job. At least the parts of it that they gave me, I didn't get the rewarding parts of that job. And then I delivered furniture in college for a while, and again, was a really hard job that didn't pay very well. And when I think of those types of jobs, I think of this feeling where you work hard, you do something, you sacrifice, and you get paid for it, and you look at the check and you're like, that was not worth this. I'm sure you've had some examples of this in your own life. Sometimes what you do for what you get in return just leaves you feeling regret, leaves you feeling pretty unsatisfied. So on this Wednesday of Holy Week, with this in mind, I want us to just think about, for a few minutes, Judas. You probably know the story of Judas well enough. He was one of Jesus' closest friends and followers, but he would accept what was essentially a job that left him full of regret, and he got paid for it, but almost immediately knew that it wasn't worth it. No amount of money would have been, but here's what we read in Luke 22, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way, the Bible says, to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12, and Judas went to the other chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. And they were delighted, the Bible says, and agreed to give him money. And he consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present." And so we read this story, but we don't typically pause long enough to think about what it was like to be Judas, to put ourselves in his shoes or his sandals. And I want us to take just a moment to do that as we are on this Easter week. It had to be a really difficult decision if you're him. Like imagine you've been following Jesus, you've become close friends with him over the past 2-3 years. You've sacrificed a lot to follow him. You kind of put the rest of your life on pause just to be his student. But maybe the longer that you follow Jesus, the more you've gone along with kind of his strange nomadic way of life. The more you bounce around from town to town with no real home, the more you realize you don't really have much tangibly to show for it. It doesn't feel like you have anything more than what you started with. You just got the clothes on your back, and you've actually sacrificed quite a lot, and you just start asking yourself, is it worth it? Maybe you start to second guess. Is the commitment really worth it? And you look around and you see people like, I don't know, for Judas, you see somebody like Nicodemus or Zacchaeus, and they live a pretty comfortable life, and he kind of wants that for himself. And so you start looking for ways to make a few extra bucks. to have more of a financial cushion. Now you keep that as a secret because you don't want it to look like you're compromising. You don't want Jesus to think that you aren't completely devoted to him and his ways, but you just become more and more aware of opportunities to, monetize your relationship with Jesus. You still love him, but you love money. You love what money can buy. And why can't you have both? You've heard Jesus teach and say things like, you can't serve two masters, but you think you can. And then it happens, and it always happens. You reach a place where you have to choose between the two. And one day, you have a conversation with a couple of religious leaders who are interested in ending the ministry of Jesus. You're conflicted internally because you love Jesus, and you love what Jesus is doing, and you're close to him, but you're also ready to live a more normal life. And frankly, you're frustrated that Jesus isn't using his influence in a more political way, a more savvy way. And so kind of in this moment when you're caught up in fear and caught up in pressure and caught up in spiritual darkness, you agree to do something you never thought you would do, betray your commitment to Jesus for some money. In Matthew's account of these events, we find out that Judas was paid 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. It's interesting, though, because in that time and culture, 30 pieces of silver was the price of a common slave. And so the price they settle on was very much an insult from the religious leaders. They're implying that the price for Jesus was the price of a slave in their society. That he was worth to them about the same amount as a slave, 30 pieces of silver. But it was also telling about the condition of Judas's heart. I mean, for years he'd been doing all the same things that the other disciples of Jesus had done. He was close to Jesus, but when the opportunity to compromise his commitment to Jesus arose, we find out the real condition of his heart. And I think it's really easy for us all these years later to look at Judas and wonder, why in the world would you do something so messed up for so little in return? For Judas, the cost of compromise was 30 pieces of silver. That's all the payment he required. That was his price. But I think the question for us to think about on this Wednesday is our commitment to Jesus, is it being compromised? Is there a price tag on our commitment? Do we compromise our commitment to Jesus for a payoff that really isn't very good, for just very little in return? When we see this decision of compromise in the life of Judas, it seems obvious to us that it's a bad exchange, and we wonder how he could do something like that. I mean, of course it's going to lead to all kinds of regret. And we see this in other people's lives pretty clearly, but we have a hard time recognizing that kind of compromise or that kind of darkness in our own life. When we are in a moment of compromise, it's hard to clearly see what a bad exchange is taking place. It's like when you're, it's like when you're on a diet and you keep seeing commercials for, let's say, the Crunchwrap Supreme at Taco Bell. And when you see these commercials or when you drive by Taco Bell, it looks pretty appealing and rewarding. And so you finally give in and you buy it. And almost immediately you're disappointed and dissatisfied. I mean, it tasted great for a moment. Like in the moment, your taste buds enjoyed every second of it. But it only takes a couple of minutes to recognize that your decision isn't what was best in the long run and didn't reflect the commitment that you wanted to be true of you. And we see that happen in the story of Judas. He's instantly filled with regret, so much so that he didn't really see much reason or hope to keep living. There was a reward for his compromise, 30 pieces of silver, but clearly the reward wasn't worth it. And I don't know if we can be honest enough with ourselves, but all of us have experienced that kind of compromise, that kind of regret to some degree. Compromise kind of runs its advertisements in our own minds. It offers us these rewards, but the reward is never worth it. So we could walk away from this text with the message of, sin is bad, so let's stop it. And that would be completely true and important for us to understand, but it's not complete because Christianity isn't just about getting rid of sin. It's about experiencing life. John 3:17 lets us know that God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. God's heart in sending Jesus into the world was not to just show how bad we are, but to demonstrate how good he is. God knows how much it would cost to pay for our compromise. Compromise runs its advertisements in our minds and offers enticing rewards, but the reward is never worth it. So on this Wednesday, let's just stop and let's take an honest look at our lives. Where have we compromised in our commitment to Jesus? What decisions are we making that we know will lead to regret? And as we approach Easter, let's just recommit ourselves to living lives that are fully devoted to following Jesus. On this Wednesday, I just want to challenge you to have an honest moment where you choose your commitment to him over anyone or anything else in your life.
Come on, brothers, let's go down.